An ugly African woman cleans an Arab man's house without knowing. He's actually an Arab executive in love with her. Every morning, she arrived quietly at the luxurious villa, tucked behind tall iron gates, armed only with her cleaning supplies and the heavy silence of a woman the world refused to see. She wasn't beautiful by society's standards. That's what they always told her. Her dark skin, her strong features, her tired eyes. People stared, whispered, dismissed her. So she stopped looking in mirrors, stopped expecting anything from anyone. To her, she was just a cleaning woman, just a maid. But to him, she was the only person who ever brought warmth into his cold, lonely mansion. She never looked him in the eyes, just bowed slightly, did her job, and left. She thought he was just another client, silent, distant, uninterested. What she didn't know was that the man sitting in the shadows of that golden living room was the owner of the entire estate. And far more than that, an Arab executive, powerful, wealthy, respected, and hopelessly in love with the woman no one else ever saw. He had watched her in silence for months. The gentle way she handled things, the way she hummed softly when she thought she was alone, the kindness in her gestures. In a world of plastic beauty and shallow attention, she was the only one who felt real. And even though she didn't know his name, even though she never dared ask who he really was, she had already changed his life. But now, something inside him was shifting. The silence had gone on long enough, and the day he finally speaks, nothing will ever be the same. Before we begin this emotional journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That's how we bring more powerful and unforgettable stories like this one directly to you. The sun had barely risen when Amina stood outside the massive wrought iron gate, her breath visible in the early morning chill. Her gloved hands clutched the handle of her cleaning cart, the wheels squeaking softly as she pushed it through the stone path that led to the villa. She didn't dare glance up at the towering windows or the polished marble entrance. She never did. Her job wasn't to be seen. It was to clean. Her reflection briefly caught her attention in the glass door. She looked away quickly. Her mother had once told her she had kind eyes, that her beauty would be recognized by the right person someday. But that was long ago, before the world had taught her otherwise. People didn't hold doors for her. Men didn't compliment her. Strangers avoided eye contact. She had grown used to being invisible. She entered the villa quietly, like she always did. The silence inside was thick, padded with luxury. Gold accents gleamed along the staircase railing, and expensive art lined the halls. Everything smelled of wealth and loneliness. She pulled out her cleaning cloth and started with the front room, gently wiping the surfaces without disturbing the carefully placed decor. She never saw the man who lived here. Not really. He was there sometimes, sitting in the far corner of the living room, dressed in pristine white robes, silent, unreadable. She assumed he was some kind of businessman. He never gave orders, never even introduced himself. What she didn't know was that he knew everything about her. His name was Zaid al-Mansur. 41. CEO of a Middle Eastern investment firm with offices in Dubai, London, and now, discreetly, in this very city. He had bought this villa as a quiet place to escape the pressure, a fortress of solitude. But Amina had turned that fortress into something else. She didn't know it, but she had softened its walls. Zaid stood in the upstairs corridor, where she couldn't see him, watching through the railing as she worked. He never meant to notice her. But the first day she entered, there was something in the way she moved. Humble, graceful, focused. Something about her felt different, real. In a world of endless meetings, fake smiles, and women who chased his name more than his heart, Amina had no idea who he was. And that was exactly what made her so powerful to him. He had learned her routines. Mondays, she would hum quietly while dusting. Thursdays, she wore a red bracelet on her left wrist. Maybe a gift, maybe something sentimental. On Fridays, she would always pause for a moment by the window facing the garden. He didn't know why, but that small act had become his favorite part of the day. She was nothing like the women who attended his corporate galas or luxury events. And still, she was the only one he couldn't stop thinking about. Amina moved to the hallway mirror, the one near the grand staircase. She wiped it gently, and for a brief second, her own reflection stared back at her. The lighting was cruel. She frowned at herself and turned away. Behind her, Zaid stood silently on the upper floor, heart tight in his chest. He wanted to tell her, not just who he was, but what he felt. But how could he? Wouldn't it scare her? Wouldn't it feel like pity? He didn't want her to think his interest came from guilt or curiosity. He wanted her to know he saw her, not her job, not her appearance, but the soul behind those eyes. Just then, she did something unexpected. As she turned toward the living room, her hand brushed the edge of a crystal vase. It wobbled. Amina reached quickly to catch it, but it tipped, crashing to the floor. Shards flew across the marble. She froze in place, her hands trembling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into the silence, eyes wide with panic. She didn't know he was watching, and he didn't expect his own body to move so fast. Zaid stepped forward from the shadows, his voice calm but firm. "Leave it," he said, for the first time speaking directly to her. She turned, startled, looking up at him for the very first time. And for the first time, he looked her in the eyes. Her breath caught. So did his, and in that one shared look, Something shifted. Amina didn't know how long she stood there, frozen, her eyes locked with his. It was the first time she had truly seen him, not just a silhouette in the distance or a figure behind a newspaper. He was standing just a few steps away now, his tall frame calm, composed, but his eyes, they were different. They held something that didn't match the cold marble around them, something that almost looked like gentleness. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Zaid took one slow step forward. "I said, leave it." The softness in his tone was unexpected, not angry, not impatient, just certain. Amina quickly stepped back from the broken glass, flustered. Her hands fumbled for the edge of her apron, her eyes dropping to the floor again. "I'll clean it. I didn't mean to—" "I know you didn't," he interrupted gently. "Accidents happen." It was the longest sentence he had ever spoken to her. She nodded, unsure of what else to say. Her heart was racing. She felt exposed, like the ground had shifted under her feet. Why was he being kind? Why was he still standing there? Zaid studied her for a moment longer, then turned away as calmly as he'd arrived. "You can finish the rest later," he said, already walking down the hallway. "There's tea in the kitchen. You should have some." "Tea?" Amina blinked, stunned. Never in all the houses she had cleaned had anyone offered her tea. She wasn't even sure if it was an order or a suggestion. She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at the hallway, but he had already disappeared. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Her hands moved, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the way he looked at her. Not with disgust, not with pity, but with something she couldn't quite name. And the way he spoke, careful, deliberate, almost protective. She didn't drink the tea. She couldn't. Just the idea made her nervous. By the time she left, her heartbeat had only just begun to settle. She told herself it was nothing. He was probably just being polite. Rich people did strange things sometimes. Maybe he didn't want to be bothered. Maybe he pitied her. Maybe he just didn't want her touching his expensive things anymore. But no matter how many explanations she told herself, one thing lingered. He had looked her in the eyes, and not like the others, not with judgment, not with discomfort. He had looked at her like she mattered. That night, Zaid sat in the garden behind the villa, his phone face down on the table beside him. He had a dozen messages from board members, 2 missed calls from a prince in Qatar, and a calendar stacked with negotiations for the week. But his mind wasn't on any of it. It was on her. He had broken his silence. Not because he planned to, but because he couldn't help it. Seeing her panic when the vase fell had made something inside him tighten. She looked like she expected punishment, like she was bracing for shame. That look haunted him. What kind of life had she lived to expect that kind of reaction? He thought about the small scar on her hand, the one he'd seen when she reached for the vase. It wasn't fresh, It looked old, faded, like a wound she'd carried for years. He wondered what story it held. He wondered what other scars she had that the world couldn't see. Zaid exhaled, his hands clasped in front of him. She had no idea who he was. No idea that he'd sat through meetings and flown across oceans thinking of her. No idea that every time she stepped into the villa, something in him stirred. Something he'd tried to bury long ago. But now, it was too late. He'd spoken. The line had been crossed. Tomorrow, she would come again. He knew it. But would she look at him the same? Would she avoid his eyes again? Or worse, would she stop coming altogether? He wasn't sure what terrified him more. The next morning, Emina hesitated outside the villa gate for the first time in weeks. She tightened her scarf, adjusted her cleaning apron, and told herself to stop being ridiculous. He probably forgot everything already. Rich men had bigger things to think about than broken vases and shy maids. Still, her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the gate's buzzer. It opened with the usual slow hum. She pushed her cart inside like always, head down, eyes averted. Everything looked the same. The gold-trimmed hallway, the scent of imported sandalwood in the air, the silence. But something was different. She could feel it in the walls, hear it in the stillness, the kind of quiet that listened back. She set her things down and began wiping the mirror near the staircase, the same one from yesterday. Her eyes flicked up just for a second, and she caught her reflection. She saw the nervousness in her own face, the tension in her shoulders. She didn't recognize herself. The sound of footsteps made her jump. He was there again, standing at the top of the staircase, dressed in another crisp white thobe, barefoot, hands behind his back, watching her. She lowered her gaze quickly and stepped aside, allowing him room to pass. But he didn't move. Zaid remained silent for a moment, then finally said, "You didn't drink the tea." His voice was low, steady, but there was something almost disappointed in it. Amina swallowed hard. "No, sir. I didn't want to assume." "It wasn't an order," he said. "It was a gift." She looked up, just briefly. His expression was unreadable, calm as always. But his eyes held that same quiet intensity as yesterday. "I'm not used to gifts," she said, regretting the words as soon as they left her mouth. Zaid tilted his head slightly. "You should be." Her breath caught. There was a pause, thick and awkward. She clutched the cleaning cloth tighter, her fingers trembling just slightly. "I should get back to work," she mumbled, turning toward the hall. But just as she stepped away, she heard him say her name for the first time. Amina. She froze. She hadn't told him her name. Not once. Slowly, she turned back to face him, confused. How How do you know my name? I asked the agency, he said simply. I wanted to know who was filling this house with music every Thursday. Her lips parted in shock. I didn't mean to. I like it, he said. Silence. Amina didn't know what to do with this moment. She had worked for years in the homes of strangers, wealthy, cold, demanding. No one had ever spoken her name like that. No one had ever said they liked hearing her. No one had ever seen her. She looked away, trying to steady her thoughts. Zaid walked down the steps slowly, his presence quiet but commanding. As he reached the bottom, he turned toward the sitting room and spoke again. Come, just for 5 minutes. No cleaning, just tea. She stood still. It felt like a test, like a trap, like something she had no right to accept. I'm working, she said softly. He turned his head slightly. I pay you to clean, but I also pay you to breathe. You never do that in here. Her chest tightened. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how rich people spoke to her. This wasn't how any of this worked. And yet, she followed. One step, then another. She entered the sitting room with him, still holding the cleaning cloth like a shield. He gestured toward a chair across from his, where a delicate cup of tea already waited. I made it myself, he said, sitting across from her. It's the only thing I know how to make well. She hesitated, then slowly sat. He didn't stare. He didn't push. They sat in silence for several minutes, sipping tea. Her hands were stiff, her body tense, but something inside her began to melt. Not because of the tea, but because of the way he was looking at her. Not through her, at her. Finally, she whispered, Why are you being kind to me? Zaid placed his cup down gently. Because the world hasn't been, and that's a tragedy. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But for the first time since she had started working in that house, she smiled. Just barely. But he saw it, and in that one curve of her lips, he felt hope. The next morning, Amina arrived at the villa with a strange flutter in her chest. She hadn't slept well. Her dreams had been filled with broken mirrors, warm tea, and the sound of Zaid's voice repeating her name. She didn't know what yesterday had meant. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. She touched the scarf on her head, adjusting it nervously before stepping inside. The air in the villa was different again, but this time, not in a good way. Voices echoed faintly from the grand living room. One voice was Zaid's, calm, controlled. The other was sharp, accented, and full of irritation. She paused in the hallway, frozen. Why is she still working here? The unfamiliar voice snapped. Zaid didn't answer immediately. You know how this looks, the man continued. You're a public figure, an Arab executive for God's sake, and you have her walking around your house. Amina's heart dropped. She didn't need to see the man to know the type. Polished shoes, tailored suit, expensive cologne, empty soul. She had cleaned after men like him before. Men who smiled in public and whispered venom in private. "She's none of your concern, Khaled," Zaid said finally, his tone colder than Amina had ever heard. Khaled laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. "You're a businessman, not a poet. You don't have the luxury of being sentimental about the help. What if someone sees her, starts talking? You want headlines about the mystery maid you're having tea with?" Amina turned away, her face burning with shame. She walked quickly to the guest bathroom and closed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the sink. Mystery maid. The help. She should have known. She should never have sat at that table, never have taken that cup of tea. What was she thinking? That a man like Zaid, powerful, elegant, educated, could ever truly see her as anything but a temporary presence in his world? She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The lighting was unforgiving. Her eyes were tired, her skin dull under the fluorescent bulb. She wiped her cheek roughly, as if erasing the trace of that almost smile she had let herself wear the day before. In the living room, Khaled's voice grew quieter, more mocking. "Is this what you've become? Hiding behind curtains, chasing maids? What would your father say if he saw this?" Zaid didn't respond. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Then his voice returned, low, firm, final. "You've said enough. Leave." Khaled scoffed, and seconds later, Amina heard the sharp click of shoes walking toward the door, the sound of it slamming shut behind him. She waited a moment longer, then unlocked the bathroom door quietly. When she stepped out, she didn't expect to see Zaid standing just outside, waiting. His expression was unreadable. "You heard him," he said softly. Amina nodded. "I'm sorry," he added. She shook her head. "You don't have to be. He's right." Zaid flinched. "No, he isn't." "You're a powerful man," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You have a name, a reputation, and I'm just—" "Don't say it," he interrupted, his eyes fierce now. "Don't you dare reduce yourself to what people like him say you are." Amina blinked back tears, but one escaped. She turned away quickly, but he stepped forward, his voice gentler this time. "I don't care what they say. I've lived long enough to know the difference between status and worth. And you, Amina, you carry more worth in your silence than most do in their entire careers." She didn't know how to respond. But in that moment, something inside her shifted. Not because he defended her, but because for the first time in her life, someone stood up for her. And not just anyone. Him. The next day, the villa was too quiet. Zaid stood by the large window in the main hallway, staring out at the front gate. It was already past 8. She was always here by 7:45. Always. Rain or shine. Silent as a shadow, but always there. Not today. The cleaning cart didn't appear. The buzzer didn't sound. Her soft footsteps on the marble floors never came. She was gone. At first, he told himself she might be running late. Maybe the agency called her away. Maybe there was traffic. But hours passed, and the truth settled in his chest like a stone. She wasn't coming back. Amina had vanished, and he knew why. Khaled's words, cruel, calculated, had done their damage. Not to Zaid. He was used to people like Khaled. But Amina, she had believed them. Believed that she didn't belong in a world where men like Zaid existed. He had seen it in her eyes yesterday. That fear, that shame, that quiet retreat behind the old walls she had built to protect herself. And now she had run. He had waited too long. Across the city, Amina sat in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, her scarf clutched tightly in her hands, her phone face down on the bed. She had blocked the agency's number. She knew Zaid wouldn't call. He was far too proud for that. And yet, some irrational part of her had expected something, a message, a word, a knock on her door. But there was nothing. The silence confirmed what her mind had whispered all night. She had been foolish. She was a cleaner, a shadow, someone who slipped in and out of rooms without being remembered. That's how it had always been. She didn't belong in conversations with powerful men. She didn't belong in villas made of glass and gold. She didn't belong in a chair across from him, sipping tea as if it were a fairy tale. What had she expected? A romance? A miracle? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the memory away. The memory of him defending her. Of his voice saying her name like it meant something. Of the way he looked at her like she wasn't invisible. She had made the right choice. She had to. Still. Her chest ached. By nightfall, Zaid was pacing. He had opened his laptop, closed it, dialed the agency, then hung up before it rang. He wasn't used to chasing people. People chased him. Negotiations, contracts, women, investors, they all came to him. But this was different. This wasn't about pride. It was about loss. And he realized something terrifying. He missed her. Not just her presence, her cleaning or her quiet voice, but the way she had made his home feel alive. She had turned silence into warmth, loneliness into peace. And now that she was gone, the house felt colder than ever. He walked into the living room where she used to dust. He touched the edge of the table she always straightened. He stared at the empty teacup she had never finished. And then, without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and called the agency. When they picked up, he said only one thing. I need her back. And I don't care what it takes. But Amina wasn't waiting for a call. She was already preparing to leave the city. A suitcase sat half-packed on her bed. She had taken out the small envelope of cash she kept hidden beneath the floorboard. Emergency money she never thought she'd need. She wasn't sure where she'd go yet. Maybe back to the town, where no one asked questions, where she could be invisible without the pain. She couldn't risk seeing him again. It would hurt too much, and if he asked her to stay, she might say yes. She couldn't let herself be that vulnerable again. She zipped the bag shut, but just as she reached for the door, there was a knock, soft, 3 times. She froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She walked slowly toward the door, her breath shallow, and when she opened it, she didn't expect to see him standing there. Zaid, wearing no suit, no expensive watch, no bodyguards, just simple clothes, just him. His eyes met hers, and he said softly, "You left, but I didn't give you permission to disappear." Amina stood frozen. Zaid didn't move. She didn't know what to say. She had imagined this moment in tears, in silence, in regret, but never like this. Not with him standing at her door, looking not like a powerful man, but like someone afraid of losing something real. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "But you are," he said. She looked down. "It's not our world. You have yours. I have mine. I don't want mine without you in it." She met his eyes. "I'm not like the women you're used to." "I know," he said. "That's why I came." For the first time, she didn't argue. She just stepped aside and let him in. They sat on the edge of her bed. No marble floors, no golden frames, just a small room with peeling walls and a single light bulb. And yet, Zaid looked more at home than ever. "I didn't grow up with much," Amina said softly, "and I never thought I deserved more." "You deserve everything," he said. She turned to him, eyes full. "Why me?" He reached for her hand. "Because you're the only one who made me feel human." She didn't respond with words. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. It wasn't a yes. It was something deeper. It was trust. The staff at the villa watched in silence as Amina entered through the front doors, not with a cleaning cart, but hand in hand with Zaid. No one said a word. She didn't lower her head. She walked beside him, not behind him. Later that evening, he sat with her on the balcony as the city lights glowed beneath them. He kissed her hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. He had introduced her as his guest, not his maid, not his mistake, his choice. Months passed. The world talked, but Zaid didn't care. They moved slowly. No rushed promises, no grand declarations. Just morning tea, quiet laughter, and fingers that always found each other in the dark. One night, as they sat beneath the stars, Amina whispered, "Do you ever wish I looked different?" Zayd smiled. "Only if you wished I were someone else." She blinked away a tear, and he leaned closer. "You were never invisible," he said. "The world just didn't know how to see you." And in that moment, she finally believed it. She was seen. She was loved. And for the first time in her life, she was enough.